So I'm Dr. Keith Bramwell. I'm the director over the Hatchery Consultancy for Jamesway Incubator Company. And I've been hosting these webinars since we started them, for most of them since we started several years ago. Our guest today is Dr. Pettit from Highline International, or Highline North America. She's been with them for 7 years as a technical services veterinarian, working in monitoring health of breeder flocks, hatcheries, looking at biosecurity programs, and involved with all aspects of layer production from the pedigree all the way down through the commercial aspect of it. So she's got a wealth of knowledge across the board from a lot of different areas in developing protocols and management practices and stuff for the industry. So really looking forward to her comments today. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Pettit, and let you go forward with your presentation, and then we will see when we're done, and we'll have a good little question and answer discussion. So if you would share your screen and go ahead, then perfect.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Keith. So with my background, I handle primarily the parent stock breeders as well as the hatcheries that we send those eggs to. So my background's actually quite a bit within our own hatchery systems and everything. And biosecurity has kind of been one of our biggest focuses over the last couple of years. I mean, between AI and all the other diseases that have been running around the United States and around the world, biosecurity is definitely one of the hottest topics right now. Biosecurity on the farms has definitely always been the first thing that people think about, but then biosecurity in the hatcheries is just as important. If we don't keep our hatcheries safe, we won't be able to keep our poultry industry in the United States and around the world safe. So let's see here. There we go. So biosecurity, a little bit of this you may have seen if you've been watching any of the other webinars from Jamesway on the topic, but I'm just going to reiterate a couple of the key points. So biosecurity, what is it? It's a really big, scary word for a lot. It is basically what we do to keep diseases or other challenges, the agents that cause these diseases out of a particular area. We could be talking about the farms. We could be talking about the hatchery. Honestly, biosecurity also pertains to humans. So all the steps that we do to keep diseases out of, say, a daycare full of kids, washing hands, prepping food properly, stuff like that also counts as biosecurity, because we want to make sure that whatever population of creatures, whether that's humans, chickens, cattle, pigs, whatever, we want to make sure we keep them safe. The key thing with biosecurity, it is reduction of risk. It is not the elimination of risk. There are a few things where you may be able to completely eliminate a risk, but it's very rare that we come across that sort of situation. Usually what we can best do is create strategies that will reduce the risk that poses to us to a level that we can manage. So biosecurity versus sanitation. Biosecurity, we basically are trying to keep the bad stuff out, or we're trying to keep the bad stuff in if we do have, in the event of a outbreak of disease within a farm or within a hatchery, we want to make sure we don't spread that anywhere else. So biosecurity works in both directions. Sanitation, a lot of times gets mixed up into biosecurity. It is definitely a very important part of it. Sanitation is going to be reducing the levels of the bad things within our area of operations. So very good webinar on sanitation in the hatcheries was put on by Tommy Lively. I definitely recommend that. Follow the link that's right there. Very good tips on cleaning your hatcheries and keeping bioburdens down. So biosecurity is ongoing. It is something that we are going to continue talking about. After a while, it sounds like you've heard everything there could be to say about biosecurity, but it is so important for disease control that it's something that we're going to have to keep talking about, and we have to constantly be thinking about in every part of our management of the hatcheries, management of the farms, and everything in between. So a really good webinar, another really good webinar was put on by Henry Cole not too long ago. Here's the link for it. I will be kind of going a little bit simpler and yet a little bit beyond what Henry talked about. He went into a lot of really good tips within the hatchery for both cleaning as well as keeping diseases out. I am going to challenge everybody during this webinar to think about more of the bigger picture. So that's why I called this webinar Going Back to the Basics. I'm not going to talk to you about exactly what biosecurity is, although I did in one slide there, because to me, at this point in time, if you're in the industry, it should be something that you have thought about and considered before. What I'm going to challenge you to think about, though, is why and how can we improve? What are we not thinking about that can therefore help reduce our risks of disease introduction down the road? So why do we have biosecurity programs? 3 main reasons: animal safety, food safety, and human safety. So all of these 3 things together are equally important for how we consider the diseases that come into our hatcheries. Depending on which route we're looking at, which of this triangle we are focusing on at the moment, determines which diseases that we are looking at, and also determines how we create those mitigation strategies based on the diseases that we're considering. So for instance, for animal safety, do we need to worry about foreign animal diseases that are going to be introduced either into our hatcheries or into our breeder farms? For food safety, salmonella is one of the biggest hot topics, not just in the United States, but around the world. Public perception for both the food safety and the human safety. So with the pandemic, the last couple of years, COVID-19, I know that's not a good word these days, but it changed how people viewed the poultry industry in different countries. It also changed how we viewed our human safety within our hatcheries, which is just as important. If we don't have employees in our hatcheries, it's kind of hard to hatch chicken or turkey or duck. So biosecurity on the farms. This right here is a very common slide. You'll see something like this in almost any biosecurity presentation that's ever given. What I'm challenging you to think about, because a lot of times we start at the farms of biosecurity, is look at how similar that is to biosecurity of the hatchery. So many of the topics, so many of the possible sources of contamination are the same whether you're looking at a farm or whether you're looking at this hatchery. And then you got to look at the diseases that are coming into the hatchery. What are you trying to keep out? So the ones that I have here are definitely not an exhaustive list of all the diseases. These are just a couple of the key ones that are vertically transmitted. We call it transovarian passage of the diseases. These are ones, minus avian influenza, of course. I just put that one on there because that's, of course, one of the hottest topics these days. These are diseases we need to make sure that we don't transmit from a breeder flock through the hatchery to whatever customer we're sending them out to, whether that is our own internal placements or whether that is a customer we're selling chicks to. So the big things is identify your risks. So waste management is definitely one of the biggest ones that has come across during AI. Waste management was one of the biggest things that we found was the highest risk for transmission onto the farms. Now, we don't know, is this also going to be one of our highest risks for transmission in the hatcheries? But I can almost guarantee you, considering the routes of transmission, either through dead bird pickup and garbages, or if we're bringing anything back with our chick and shell waste trailers or dump trucks, that's definitely going to be one of the highest risks we deal with. Pests. Do we have any rodent activity? Any birds getting into our hatcheries? Insects? Look at your employees. Do you have the same amount of training for all of the people that are going in and out of the hatchery? Same thing with management and any visitors. Supplies, trucking, egg movement. One of the big things that I would challenge you to think about is testing for your source flocks. Now, if you're dealing with eggs coming from flocks that are not within your own system, that might be a little bit more challenging. But ask your suppliers, do they have the testing results for certain diseases? SE, PT. Do they have source flocks that are vaccinated for CAV, and we make sure we have good CAV titers on the parent birds? Knowing where our eggs are coming from, also within our own system, and knowing that our testing is up to date is going to be very important for making sure that we don't pass something on unintentionally to whoever is downstream from our product and from our hatchery. Also, make sure you look at the equipment necessary to complete all of these tasks. Anything within the hatchery or anything surrounding the hatchery, what could pose a risk for us? And the next step in biosecurity is quantifying your risks, because I would like to say that we have an unlimited budget and we can block all risk out there. But the truth is, money is finite. We have to determine where the money is going to be spent. So look at the cost of an intervention, look at the amount of time it's going to take, look at the effort it's going to take. Is this going to take every employee I have in the hatchery and pull them away from their normal jobs to maybe mitigate a particular risk? Versus, is there another risk that we can put some safeguards in place, not cost as much money, and have just as big an impact? So that's where looking at the efforts in the inputs versus the benefit is going to be very important in understanding where are we going to best use our resources. We are once again trying to reduce our risk, not eliminate in most cases. The other big thing with all of this, with designing a biosecurity program, is every system is going to be a little different. There is no cookie cutter biosecurity program that's going to work for everybody. If you go and steal another company's biosecurity plan for their hatchery and try to put it onto yours, I can guarantee you there will be very big holes in that plan, because everybody's buildings are a little different. Everybody's employee base is a little different. Everybody's challenges outside, physical challenges in the environment, differences in the source flocks, differences in diseases in the area. Everything's going to be a touch different. So therefore, there's never going to be two hatcheries with the exact same system. Now, you can try to use similar protocols, standard operating procedures across hatcheries, but there's always going to be a little bit of tweaking to make it fit. And that tweaking is going to be the difference between having a mediocre to good biosecurity plan and having a really effective biosecurity plan. The NPIP 14-point biosecurity audit came out in the United States to help with flocks, not just breeder flocks, but also with commercial flocks, and helping identify areas of risk in their biosecurity plans. What I challenge you to do is look at this and understand where these points can actually impact the hatcheries as well. Almost every one of these, yes, we don't really have manure or litter in our hatcheries. But we do have waste management. We might not have mortality as in dead birds, but we do have, in the case of layer hatcheries, male chicks that we have to dispose of. All of these areas, and I know over in Europe, there's even consideration of using different ways of feeding chicks when they're leaving the hatcheries. For some that are going on long distance drives, any of the food or water solutions that you can put in the chick boxes. All of these areas are very important to consider when we're looking at building a biosecurity plan for the hatchery. So a couple key things, responsibility and training. To me, this is one of the most important parts of biosecurity. You can put all of the mitigation strategies in place that you want to, but they are going to fail unless you have a leadership team, either an individual or team, that understands what they're doing and wants it to succeed. And it won't succeed unless you have employee buy-in, which is where training comes in, and helping employees understand not just the hows, but the whys. So if you don't have this backbone, if you don't have the responsibility in place and you don't have the training in place and buy-in from both management and employees, your biosecurity program is bound to fail. However, if you have this in place, if you have a good team, if your employees understand why, they will go above and beyond to help you find all the holes in your biosecurity plan and plug them before you even know they're there. So getting that buy-in from your employees, from your hatchery managers, from your team, that's going to be imperative. So for personnel, explain to them what is biosecurity. I know I can't tell you how many hatcheries I've been in and how many farms I've been in that people never actually explain what biosecurity is to the employees. They just say, oh, you need to change your boots and you need to change your clothes, but they never explain how or why. And so the people don't follow exactly what you are trying to get, or they're following the letter, but not the intent of what you're trying to do. Biosecurity, I have here, biosecurity is only as strong as your weakest link. If you have individuals, which I know will always have some employees that don't care as much as others, but if you don't explain to all of your individuals why biosecurity is so important, they're going to go, oh, I just want to run out to my car. I don't need to change my shoes. And they're going to ignore all the biosecurity steps you have in place. And that's going to negate all the hard work that all the rest of the employees have done. So making sure that not only the buy-in is from your management, but from the employees that will hold each other accountable is very, very important. Work with your employees to understand risk factors at home. So I know on Henry's webinar previously, he talked about going hunting and going golfing, other things that could bring you into contact with birds, with wild birds, wild waterfowl, other things that could be carrying diseases. We're never going to stop them from having hobbies. As much as we would love to say no hunting, no contact with backyard birds, anything like that, people are always going to want to go golfing. They're always going to want to go duck hunting. They're going to want to visit their friends who have backyard poultry. So rather than saying no and having them go behind your back, work with them to come up with mitigation strategies. Explain why it's so important and be like, hey, can you wear a different pair of shoes when you come to the hatchery versus when you go visit your friend who has 6 backyard chickens? Things like that. If you work with them, you'll be surprised at how well your biosecurity plan can be developed and be followed. Make sure that they have a vested interest. So work with your employees so they are part of the solution. Don't just create these programs, slap them into place and say, this is what we're going to do. Work with them. And I would also challenge you that they would be very helpful in coming up with potentially some surprising ways of mitigating risk that you might not have thought of, but will work really well in your system or your hatchery. So have your employees help out with this sort of stuff. If they feel like they've had a part in creating these biosecurity programs, they're much more likely to they're much more likely to follow them. The line of separation. It's one of the concepts that came a little bit before the 14-point biosecurity audit, but is a very key part of that audit. The line of separation is basically where we mark the clean area, which for us will be the hatchery if we don't have an active disease challenge going on, versus the rest of the world, which quite honestly, I run with the thought that everything outside of my hatchery is dirty. I don't know what diseases are out there. I don't know what's on the sidewalk. I don't know what's in vehicles. I don't know what's in the grocery store. So the best way to look at biosecurity is just to understand that since we don't know, we're going to assume everything outside the hatchery is dirty. And therefore we're going to come up with ways to keep whatever that is out, because we don't know exactly what's out there. We just want to make sure it doesn't get inside the hatchery. So a lot of times back in the day, the LOS did not have to be a visibly marked spot. A lot of times people would designate it, say it's this door or this entrance. Honestly, I found employees do a lot better if there's a very visible barrier. Now that could be brightly colored duct tape on the floor, orange paint where you spray a line and say no outside footwear over this line. Whatever it is however you create that line of separation, that LOS, it has to be something that is very easy for the employees to see and very easy for them to recognize where the clean is and where the dirty is. And that's what's going to keep you from having gray zones where, okay, so I took my outside shoes off, but then I stepped with my socks in the exact same spot, potentially picked up mycoplasma or salmonella, and now I stepped across my LOS and carried it right into my hatchery. The other thing with the line of separation is understanding it's not just where the employees enter, but all entrances and exits to that clean area. So this could be the back door to the dumpsters. This could be a side door that shouldn't be used for a smoking exit, but sometimes gets used for a smoking exit. Making sure people understand that at these LOSs, they always have to be following all of those steps, because all it takes is one break. There was a farm during the last round of avian influenza. They traced it back to, pretty sure somebody stepped outside a back door for a smoke break and stepped back in, and that undid everything that folks had been doing to keep that disease out. When thinking of the LOS, you got to think about what diseases we're trying to keep out. So avian influenza is spread by physical contamination. So that's where we potentially do a clothing change. Salmonella enteritidis, that comes in within the eggs. So maybe our intervention there is not so much a physical barrier at the LOS, but what do we need to do at the breeder farms that are sourcing eggs, testing measures, to make sure we're not bringing anything past there with contamination that we can't see or test at the LOS every single time. So here's a good example of how you could have multiple LOSs in different areas of the hatchery. So employee entrance, loading dock, side door. Changing footwear is definitely one of the most important parts of this. Depending on which system you're in, you can do anything from a full shower and clothing change down to a Tyvek and maybe just changing footwear or putting on yellow booties over. It all depends on what your risks and how you balance that cost of mitigation versus the benefit that comes out of it. And by cost, I don't just mean money, but also time, effort, everything else. Not going to go into too much detail because hopefully all of you have seen a Danish entry before, but basically, once again, illustrating keep the dirty on the dirty side and keep it out of the clean side. Wildlife control, making sure that we keep everything out of our hatcheries. So think outside the box when it comes to how could something get in? Do I have fans where maybe one of the vents is busted out and birds could potentially fly in if the fan gets turned off overnight? Could the birds fly into my hatchery through that louver that's missing? Do we have rodent control issues? Do we have any dogs or cats that are hanging around if you're in either an urban area or near other farms? Can we keep the insects out? Insects are definitely difficult, but there's a lot of methods, bug zappers, positive pressure, insect bait that we can use to keep insects from carrying anything inside the hatchery. Perimeter buffer area, another part, one of the 14 points of biosecurity that's very important for minimizing contamination. Now, this inside the perimeter buffer area is still considered dirty because that's the outside world. But if we can limit what we bring into that perimeter buffer area, limit the traffic, whether that be vehicle or foot or anything else, we can potentially reduce how much risk is outside and therefore reduce the risk of bringing anything across that LOS. So things to think about when you're doing the perimeter buffer, when you're designing your perimeter buffer area. Can we put a fence around the entire area? Can we restrict access either with that fence or with gates? Disinfection points. Are we going to use a truck disinfection where they drive through a spray bar with disinfectant to hose off all the vehicles that go through? Are we going to handle egg traffic versus chick traffic differently? Once these trailers are in, so for instance, with the egg trucks, who's going to unload them? Who unloads supplies that come in? So if we have a contract company that is dropping off paper egg flats and that employee is not trained in, and the driver is not trained in our biosecurity, do we have somebody else from the hatchery that can unload those supplies? And therefore we don't have to let this contract employee or this external company employee, who we don't know his background, we don't know if he has 20 pet parrots back at home, don't let them into the hatchery and pass the LOS. Procedures before unloading. Are we going to disinfect? Are we going to fumigate? All of these things. Where are we going to place the trash in the dumpsters? Are we going to place it close to the building so the employees don't have to walk across a lot of outside potentially contaminated space to get to them? Or are we going to put the trash and dumpsters as far from the building as we can? And therefore the truck that picks up the dumpsters doesn't have to drive anywhere near the buildings. All things to think about. There's no really one good answer for a lot of these. It's just things that you have to consider when you're creating your biosecurity plan. So for vehicles, I touched on this a little bit earlier, but what about personal vehicles, whether that's company owned individual vehicles or just your employees' home vehicles? Are we going to keep them inside or outside the PBA, your perimeter buffer area? Are we going to have them disinfect them? Do we purchase a car wash nearby and all employees have to go through the car wash on their way to work? That's definitely an extreme suggestion, but depending on what your challenge is in the area, maybe it's going to be necessary, maybe not. For chick trucks, do we assume that all of the farms do we assume all farms are contaminated? Do we just assume that all farms that are not owned by us are contaminated? One of the things that we have found in my own hatcheries is very, very important for reducing any potential transmission of disease back into the hatchery is fumigating chick boxes on the trailer on their way back. So all of the customers, even though I know a lot of them have very clean farms, it's safer for me to assume that everything outside of my hatchery is dirty and therefore I don't accidentally bring anything back. So all chick boxes that come back get fumigated on the truck before they arrive. And one of the key things is making sure they're destacked. So you can see down in the right-hand corner of the picture there, the chick boxes are not nestled in as tight as they can be. By having them destacked, this allows them to circulate this disinfectant and actually get a good kill step. Let's see here. Eggs, make sure you know where they're coming from. So are the source farms owned by your company or is it outside your company? Do you know what their status is for diseases? Are you going to fumigate the eggs once they arrive? I know 2 of the previous presentations talked about wet disinfection versus dry disinfection of eggs. How are you going to handle employee flow? I know there's a lot of talk in different areas of the world to keep egg side employees completely separate from the chick side employees. Now, is that always possible? Unfortunately, no. So how are we going to handle if the employees need to move from one area to the other? Do we consider the egg side dirty? Do we consider the chick side dirty? And here's where I challenge you. This is going to come down to what diseases are you trying to control? Now, if we look at salmonella that's in the eggs, we can test the outside and never find it. But when the chicks hatch out is when we find salmonella SE positive chicks. So in that scenario, the chicks are dirty and we want to make sure that the employees move from eggs to chicks and not back. However, in the case of avian influenza, which is killed within the incubation process, if it's on the outside of the fresh eggs that come off the farm, your employees handle them while packing them onto SSTs or other egg racks, and then they move to go help out with processing. Well, if they still have that virus on their hand, they just spread avian influenza virus from the egg that just came in from a potentially infected farm to the chicks. In this case, the eggs are considered dirty. So unfortunately, like I said before, there is no one answer that fits everything. It all depends on what diseases you're trying to keep out and how you're going to weigh the risks of the different diseases. So both of these are important for us in the United States, but depending on how the outbreak is going and our risks on the farms changes how we look at how we handle this in the hatcheries. So supplies, making sure that you have both good storage for them when they get to the hatchery. The question there is, do you make sure that you have a warehouse somewhere else where supplies can get delivered to and you fumigate them before they come to the hatchery? Do you have a room within the hatchery that you can fumigate them? Is there a way of making sure that they're clean? Because I know a lot of paper products and a lot of pallets come from warehouses that are either open to the sky or definitely have no bird control within them, within where they're being stored. So how do we make sure that they're not bringing anything into our hatcheries? If you do store anything in a separate warehouse, do you have equal biosecurity there? So making sure that we control all of these steps before is what's going to be important to make sure everything's safe. So one of the big concerns, one of the big questions is, do you test everything or do you just trust? Once again, no good answer there. There's definitely tests that you can do. Salmonella swabs to see if there's any salmonella on things. Most of your local universities will have tests for a lot of other diseases, mycoplasmas, avian influenzas that you can run swabs on and send to them, and just see if there is something there. After a while, you sometimes have to just trust in the system and make sure you have mitigation strategies in place. So maybe I can't test everything for salmonella, but I can make sure I fumigate anything that arrives and it sits for a little while so that I can make sure the risk of it carrying anything into my hatcheries is minimal. The bigger question, and this is one that opens up a whole new kettle of worms per se. Do we audit the warehouse that's coming from? The warehouse is outside of, this would be the supplier. It's not in our control. It's where we're buying it from. How do we know that they don't have bird nests over top of the paper flats that you're buying? How do we know that there isn't a rodent issue, rodents building nests in the brand new pallets you're buying to send out to your breeder farms and then back to your hatchery? A lot of questions, not a lot of answers, unfortunately, but hopefully I can make you think by bringing up all of these thoughts and concepts. Ironically enough, while I was searching for photos to put on here, anybody notice down in the bottom, I was trying to find pictures of paper flats stacked up. And I came across this one right here, used paper egg flats. Pretty good example of how you can bring some really nasty stuff into your own hatchery. Hopefully no one's doing this, but it's definitely something to consider. So vaccines, and I know I'll potentially come into, I've got some colleagues that work for vaccine manufacturers that'll probably give me the hairy eyeball with this slide, but vaccines are definitely another opportunity for disease to get into your hatchery. It can be as simple as something that's on the outside of the doors. So we don't know where these tanks have been a lot of times when they come to our hatcheries. So what do we do to mitigate that? Do you have the vaccine company drop them off at a warehouse and then you transfer vaccines to your own tanks? Do you have them drop the tanks off at a loading bay in the hatchery and then you transfer to your own tanks there? Do you disinfect these tanks really well and bring them all the way into your hatchery and your vaccine room? Now, there is no incorrect answer there. All have been done, and I've seen it done successfully with no introduction to disease. But each of those has an increasing level of risk that could bring disease into your hatchery. Not so much these days, at least in the United States, but I know historically speaking, there's been several cases around the world where vaccine itself was contaminated. And we brought a disease into the chickens from the very vaccine we were giving them. So use reputable manufacturers, use ones that you know and trust, and that they won't be sending you, and this is never a guarantee, but that you trust won't be sending you contaminated vaccines. You know that their procedures are top of the line. You know they have your best interest at heart as well. Water is often forgotten, although thankfully I did hear it talked quite a bit in the last two webinars, or not the last two webinars, but the two webinars I mentioned earlier in this talk. It's often the forgotten component of biosecurity. So where are you getting your water from? Is it coming from a municipal water source, so city water? Are you getting it from your own well? Are you pulling water from a pond or a river? And if so, if with any of these, what level of disinfection is being done to make sure that the water's clean? We can scrub and we can disinfect all we want, but if we rinse off everything with contaminated water, we've essentially negated all of the hard effort that we and our employees have done. So making sure that you consider this one, and I'm not going to go into too much detail because the other presentations went into very good detail on it. So if you have any more questions on this, I would refer you back to those two. But this is definitely something worth keeping in mind when it comes to biosecurity. Last but not least, because this one's kind of a topic that I know it has been very important in the last avian influenza outbreak, waste management. So how do we handle our trash and how do we handle the risk that comes with it. We're never going to be able to not send out trash unless you have an incinerator or a compost within your own site, which I don't know of anybody who does. How do we handle this trash? How do we make sure that we're not bringing anything back from the collection points or with the vehicles that are picking it up? Do we handle everything ourselves where we have our own dump trucks and take it to a site and then disinfect our dump trucks on the way back? Do we have contractors where we're the only ones that they handle and we have dedicated equipment to our company or to our hatchery? Or do we take that risk and we try to put in other steps around it where perhaps after the dump truck comes and picks up the garbage, we make sure we disinfect the area that he's been and we keep him as far away from the entrance to the hatchery as possible? A lot of questions, once again, not a lot of answers. Chicken shell waste is the same. How do we make sure that we are not recontaminating our hatchery when we come back from wherever that chicken shell waste is going? Are we taking it to a compost site where we're the only ones dumping there that have poultry? Maybe it's a cattle compost site. And so we know from avian diseases, we've got minimal risk, but if it's cattle, what about salmonella? Are we bringing anything like that back to our hatchery? Are we disinfecting everything that comes back to the hatchery? Lots of questions. And then finally, auditing and self-assessments. I know everybody hates the word audit, but audits can be a good thing. It helps us know where we're at within our system and where we're at within our biosecurity plan. So once you've created your biosecurity plan and implemented your biosecurity plan, where are our holes? Because there is always going to be areas of improvements that can be worked on within any plan that's created at any time, because the world is a constantly changing thing. There's always new diseases, always new challenges. So we need to make sure we stay on top of that. Having self-assessments, that especially if they involve your employees, are going to be very, very valuable. Your employees a lot of times will be able to identify issues with your biosecurity plan long before you do, because they're the ones who are hands-on in the nitty-gritty of it. They're the ones who are doing everything on a daily basis and know where the problems are. So can you have regular meetings with these employees to do these self-assessments? Do you have an anonymous box where they can write on a piece of paper and drop it in, so if they're worried about being in the spotlight? Working with showing the employees that you want their cooperation, you want their feedback, will also help them understand that biosecurity is not just another benchmarking thing. It's not just another lip service. Oh, we're going to do this because we're told to do this. Biosecurity is important for us, and it is important for them, and it will help them understand that. So definitely make sure you constantly get feedback from people, from your employees, from visitors. Ask your visitors, hey, fresh set of eyes, what are we doing wrong? What can we improve upon? They might tell you something, you're like, I don't have the money to do that. But it'll get you thinking, okay, well, how else can I mitigate this risk? Because even if their suggestion isn't viable, we might be able to come up with another solution for this risk that is. So in summary, one size does not fit all. Like I said, every hatchery is going to have a slightly different biosecurity plan that works for them. Work with your employees and your management to ensure understanding. If your managers don't understand why you're doing this, your biosecurity plan is going to fail instantly, because they're the ones who have to help explain to the employees and reinforce on a daily basis why biosecurity started so important. You need to understand your risks and the diseases that you're targeting. If you don't understand what you're trying to protect against, it's going to be really hard to design an effective biosecurity program. And then to quote Henry Cole, never assume anything. And then I would add to that, plan for the worst and hope for the best. If you can think outside the box, come up with a plan that is feasible and mitigates your risks, you will keep a lot of things out of your hatchery, and you will keep your birds, your eggs, and your people very safe. So, any questions? I think I
You
left
come
us
back
about
here.
15 minutes there.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'm back here. You can unshare your screen now if you would like. Thank you very much. That was a very good webinar. I enjoyed it. I learned a lot on there, and you said several things in there that I was in the background clapping, because it's like, yes, we need more. One of the things I know is you're making sure people know why they're doing what they're doing, because in my experience traveling internationally, I see people that have pieces of a plan to put together, but I don't think they fully understand why they're doing it, because there's these massive gaps right in it. And if they just understood why, what their point. I love that discussion in there. And I was clapping back here on that. So thank you for that.
Awesome.
Several questions in here. One, so you talked about the different ways that pathogens and challenges can come in the hatchery. So somebody is buying fertile eggs and they bring in eggs routinely to their hatchery. Do you suggest fumigating those eggs before they come in the hatchery, and how would you go about that?
So there's definitely a lot of options for fumigating. I do like fumigating. It helps reduce the bacterial burden. The key thing with fumigation is it's not going to eliminate everything that's on the outside of the shell. There's no way to sterilize that eggshell, probably short of pasteurization, at which point it might be a little bit hard to hatch that chick. But that being said, if formaldehyde is an option for you, formaldehyde is a fabulous fumigation option. It kills a lot of your bacterial burden that could be on the eggs. Then there's other products. The key thing there, because I know I'm talking to an audience that goes beyond the United States, use labels. And if you're going to try, make sure you read the labels on the products. So if you're going to try using Viricid as a fumigation product or any of the other disinfectants, make sure you read the labels, apply it per the label. If you overdo a lot of those disinfectants, they'll seal up the pores on the eggs and the eggs won't hatch, or they'll hatch very badly and you'll end up with a lot of cull chicks. So make sure you read the labels. And if you're going to try anything outside of the ordinary, I would highly recommend doing trials first with a smaller number of eggs and then working up from there. So every time we have somebody bring a new product to us, we always do a fairly extensive trial first to make sure that we're not going to harm our hatch or our downstream quality of chicks that are coming out of our hatcheries.
Yep. What about, so on the lines of fumigation, what about delivery boxes while on the truck? I mean, do you do any fumigation of the boxes and all that?
Highly recommended. We have found any of the major disinfectants, so Viricid, Synergize, even hydrogen peroxide at certain concentrations. If you do fumigation of those boxes in the egg truck, you will drastically reduce the amount of bacteria that you're bringing back into the hatchery. You're once again not going to sterilize it, but you're definitely going to reduce the risk of bringing a whole bunch of whatever bad bacteria, whether that's Salmonella, Enterococcus, anything else like that, bringing it back into your dirty chick box, which then could accidentally be tracked into the rest of the hatchery if your biosecurity at that point is not up to a high enough level.
And I've seen this a few times, or heard this, and it's not a common thing, but how about sanitizing or fumigating eggs during the incubation process, particularly if you're like a multi-stage where you got different embryos. And I've seen people do it single stage, and not a lot of people do it. And I think there's a number of reasons. I just wanted your opinion on that.
So I'm going to
point that one.
I'm actually going to point that one back at Jamesway, because I know you guys have done a lot of research on that sort of thing, or I'm assuming you have. I know I've seen something come across in a couple papers. But I'm going to pass it back in that direction, because honestly, depending on what the machine style is, I would imagine fumigation can go very, very badly, especially if you start wetting eggs during the incubation process. That would be my biggest concern with that, is you'd have to be very careful. Now, potentially doing a little bit of formaldehyde in the hatchers at the very end of hatch, that we know works very well at reducing a lot of your bacterial load.
Yeah. And fumigating in the setters is not something we recommend. Certainly. I know we've got a few customers that have done it for different reasons, but you said there's a myriad of potential problems that can be affiliated with that. I think that's why I think sometimes there's things, okay, things could possibly work if done exactly right, but if not, it's worse. And I think a lot of times we tend to just say, don't try some of these things.
Well, and the other thing that I would say is this goes back to my initial point about biosecurity versus sanitation. So if we're fumigating in the hatchers, once again, we're reducing the bacterial load there, but whatever's in there, or excuse me, in the incubators, whatever's in the incubators is already in our hatchery. So at that point in time, if it's something bad and nasty that we can't have in the hatchery, our biosecurity has already failed. So I would challenge you to almost go back and look at, okay, how did I get SE into the hatchery in the first place if that's what I'm trying to kill with this fumigation step?
Okay, speaking of salmonella and biosecurity and hatchery stuff, what are your thoughts? There's a going on in a lot of different areas about bringing feed into the hatchery in one of these systems as far as the biosecurity, because I hear some people just like, oh my gosh, we can't. I mean, I'm concerned about the biosecurity side of this. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I will start by saying before I was in chickens,
let's just say answer the part of bringing feed in. We don't need to go too deep into the whole process, but
so I came from the pig world before I was in the chicken world, and I was in the pig world when PED came about, which was delivered with feed in the first place or in feed containers. So to me, feed is definitely a high risk because very rarely do we make sure that that is as clean as it needs to be. And there's a lot of diseases that we know have been transmitted with that. I mean, we're talking everything from adenovirus, avian influenza, you go into the other species, Seneca virus, PED. There's a lot of diseases that can be transmitted in feed and it's not just the feed itself, because we can treat the feed with formaldehyde or heat treat it to make sure the feed is clean. But there's always the risk. I mean, no different than when we're trying to disinfect. We talk about 3D material, and if there's poop there, you can't disinfect poop. Feed to me is the same sort of category. You're never going to be able to guarantee that that is completely clean. Now, is it a risk that you're willing to take? This goes back to that cost versus benefit scenario.
Yeah. Yep. That's always a touchy thing sometimes, but because there's a different way people are looking at different things. In regards to your showering, and I get this question, and I've got my opinions on it. I just want your opinion. So when you're building a biosecurity program, and you had all your tracking of going through and shower in and foot, what about some hatcheries, particularly internationally? I see that they require showering out, leaving the hatchery. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, I have my own personal thoughts, and I just wonder what yours are.
So mine are, it depends on what once again, goes back to identify your risks and what you're trying to control. So if we know if you're coming from, say, a higher level of biosecurity, so I'm going to use a pedigree farm for an example. If I'm going from a parent stock hatchery to a pedigree hatchery, then showering out would be a very, very, very important step, because we want to make sure that pedigree hatchery is clean of everything. Now, if I'm going from a parent stock hatchery or commercial hatchery and I'm just going home and I'm taking vacation for 5 days, is it necessary? You could potentially contaminate your vehicle, but if you disinfect your vehicle, I don't know. That one, honestly, to me, it really depends on what we're trying to keep clean and keep safe afterwards.
Right. And I've seen areas where I think, okay, like you said, it probably is beneficial, but in a lot of cases it may not be. It just depends on who you're working with and what you're trying to fight. So
most of the time the hatchery itself is clean, so therefore we're trying to keep things out. So showering is the most important step. Showering out may or may not be as important. Now, if you don't know what your status is, if I'm going to visit a hatchery that I don't know what diseases are there, I'm probably going to shower out just to make sure I don't accidentally track anything back with me, just to make sure. Yeah,
if you're going to, especially if you're going to another one. So in your different, you talked about you're dealing with the hatcheries and farms and all that stuff and the different programs. So from a structurally sound, how different are they into building a biosecurity program between a hatchery and a farm, like applied on the farms where live birds are?
So it depends on if you're talking about new construction versus old existing buildings that you have to kind of adapt to. To me, the concepts of biosecurity are the same, or they should be the same on hatcheries as well as farms. Honestly, whether you're looking at eggs and chicks versus full-grown birds, if you don't understand what the challenges are within that system, or you know it's clean and you don't know the challenges are where you're coming from, making sure that those biosecurity steps are equal is going to be very important. The other thing is making sure that within your system, so if you're going to have people going back and forth from the hatchery to the farms to the hatchery, say one day, the next day, which I know there's a lot of systems that do that, making sure that they have equal levels of biosecurity. Now, maybe not identical, but make sure you've thought about each equally. The
Right.
biggest risk that I've seen is when everybody focuses on the breeder flocks and they don't think about the hatchery. Oh, that's where the eggs go. We don't think about them, except wait, where do the egg trucks come from? From the hatchery back to the farms.
Right.
You got to make sure that you're thinking about each in equal measure.
And I like the way you put that is a word, the biosecurity programs, are they equal? I know in dealing with primary breeders in the past, you have parent stock biosecurity, then you have GP farm biosecurity, then you have GGP, and those are different, and it affects your traffic both ways. So I think paying attention, like you said, paying attention to where you're going or where you've been could change frequency of travel or how you handle that. So I totally agree with that completely. Once people are in that hatchery, see different methods within the hatchery, do you have any recommendations of what they should do within the hatchery, like sanitizers throughout? Once they've showered in, they've got on those clothes and everything as they're moving about in the hatchery, what are things have you seen with that, or recommendations you have?
I know there's a lot of talk about keeping, like I'd said earlier, keeping eggs versus chicks separate. It all depends on what your structure is. So I know in the United States, there's a lot of hatcheries that do not have either the employee base, especially post-COVID, or the physical structure that they can actually keep those areas separate. Making sure that we minimize how much we're carrying back and forth is going to be very important, though. So unfortunately, this kind of goes away from biosecurity, because once we're in the hatchery, if that disease is in there, our biosecurity has failed. But if we're looking at, say, E. coli and making sure that we aren't carrying that off of fresh eggs to the chicks, all those standard, I'm going to call them biosecurity, but all of those standard cleanliness measures that we do even in our own homes, washing our hands, disinfecting our hands, making sure that we don't touch dirty things and then go touch clean things, all of that stuff will definitely help minimize any cross-contamination or carrying of those bioburdens throughout the hatchery.
Okay. And I've seen, like you mentioned in there, and I've seen not many hatcheries, but a few hatcheries that have a distinct difference between the egg side, and then you transfer into the hatching side, and those people on the hatching side don't go the other direction. And it doesn't happen very often, but I can see within a hatchery there being some validity to that. But like every hatchery deals with now, people and labor, it's tough to get. It's hard to say, oh, you're only allowed over there. What if we really need somebody on this side? And so, like you said, what works.
Exactly.
I mean, sometimes you have to make consultant.
It's all about reducing risk. And this goes back to the whole point of biosecurity. Everybody seems to think we have to stop a risk from happening, but we really just need to reduce the risk to where it's a manageable level. So in this sort of case, then maybe we need to use employees in both areas. We just make sure we understand what the challenges are and how to mitigate those risks.
What have you seen, like and I'm more familiar with the HACCP program more in the processing plant side and stuff like that. I mean, have you seen that trickle back into the hatchery, and how could that be implemented? Or
not so much in exact terms, but I know when AI was still is, but when AI was the really hot topic with the breeder farms of the layer world a couple months ago, I know that the concepts were very, very similar to what we looked at within our own system to try to figure out, okay, where can we put a critical control? What are the critical control points within our system, and where can we put a control in place to make sure that we don't potentially contaminate the hatchery with avian influenza? So, for example, one of the things that we looked at was time from egg collection into the hatchery and traceability. So, and this is something that I really didn't talk about because, like I said, once the disease gets into the hatchery, our biosecurity has failed. But making sure that you have really good traceability programs within your hatchery is going to be very, very important if you ever do have biosecurity fail. For instance, one of the big discussion topics with AI was, so you bring eggs from an AI positive farm into the hatchery. Yes, if you incubate those eggs, that avian influenza is going to die. If it's inside the eggshell, that egg is not going to hatch. Anything on the outside of the eggs is going to die off during the incubation process. But do we know who was handling the eggs? Did they go over and touch chicks the same day? Did they go back and handle more eggs? Being able to track all of that within your hatchery is going to be very, very important. That would be where you could potentially put a critical control point if you wanted to apply those same concepts over into the hatchery.
Yeah. And so what kind of maybe a benchmark system or tracking system? I mean, is there anything specific or someplace somebody can go to really help them in their hatchery build a good benchmarking, a good basis of what to do and when?
That's actually a really good question. I might have to get back to you on that one. I know we've got our own internal system, but from what I've heard from other folks, it seems like almost each hatchery comes up with their own way of tracking. Maybe does Jamesway have something like that would help?
Not specifically. I mean, we do offer help to individuals, but as far as a blanket thing, this is what we do now. We don't have that. And it goes into probably into like what you were saying. Every hatchery is a little bit different. And certain hatcheries have different challenges than other hatcheries for various reasons, location in the world or the type of hatchery or traffic flow. And so it's very different. It's scary sometimes to say this is what you do because it may not work everywhere. But
so something that folks can do if they're worried about that, something that can be really easy to do is actually essentially from the food side of things, do a product recall. Have one of your flock managers give you a date range for eggs from a potentially contaminated farm. Say this farm XYZ was contaminated on this day. We sent eggs from 3 days before into the hatchery. Can you track all of those eggs? See if you can find every single egg, because you should, if your record keeping's good, know how many eggs you collected on those days. See if you can find them in the hatchery. Can I find all of them in the egg room and a small chunk in the setters and pull them and potentially recall all of them? Something like that, and then figure out who's all been touching them.
Yeah, and then that goes back to the traceability and tracking of the eggs, which is, I know, something that with Jamesway are working on now, developing a system where we can really do a better job of tracking every egg or every trolley through the entire hatchery. Yep. And when that'll help in the case that you're just talking about, where did they all go, where did they come from, and everything. So that's good. So what if somebody has chicks, they're hatching in the hatchery, either they find out after the fact that the parent stock was positive for something they didn't want, or they came in and, okay, now we've got these eggs, do we dispose them or do we set them? But I mean, in both ways, one, if they're already there and you find that out, what do you do? How would you handle those within a hatchery?
Depends on the disease. Once again, depends on the disease that you're looking at. So are we talking avian influenza? Are we talking mycoplasma? Are we talking salmonella? Are we talking avian encephalomyelitis? Depending on what disease you're looking at, it could be something as easy as recalling, potentially worst case scenario, calling up the customer and saying, we need to destroy those chicks. And then that goes up the ladder to people farther above than me on how to handle that at that point in time. But that would probably be the worst case scenario. Best case scenario is here's what we might have sent you. Here's how we're going to test for it. And let's see if the chicks are actually positive. Because there's certain diseases out there that may or may not actually get into the chicks, depending on how the incubation went and whether the contamination was before the eggs were in the incubators or after the eggs were in the incubators. So it really is, unfortunately, a disease by disease situation. So if there's a particular disease anybody has a question on, email me and I'll try to get to the best answer on how to handle it.
Yeah, perfect. So if somebody does a proper, in a disinfection area, they do a proper disinfection. Is that, in most cases, is that disease eliminated, or is it subdued to enough that under less than perfect conditions later, you can see it again?
Usually once again, depends on the disease, depends on the disinfection, depends on what you're disinfecting. So eggs are notoriously hard to disinfect to the point where they're sterilized. There's a lot of pores in those eggshells that hold a lot of different bacteria and viruses. If the bacteria or the virus is inside the shell, such as in the case of any of those transovarian diseases I talked about earlier, we can disinfect to our heart's content around them, but if it's inside the eggshell, we're unfortunately not going to get to it short of pasteurization of the eggs. And even then, some diseases are still remarkably hardy. So when it comes to disinfection of areas, once it goes back to reduction. I'm not saying don't disinfect, because by reducing the amount of bacteria, virus, fungi, whatever we're dealing with, we can hopefully keep it from getting into our system if it is a disease that we don't want in there. Or in the case of E. coli, we can reduce it to the point where we know there's still E. coli there, but it's not going to cause us an issue because the level of contamination is low enough the chicks can handle it on their own.
Okay, a lot of questions still about fumigation. I'll just tell you different ones, and then what you can answer about, what to fumigate with. Is there different particular equipment that's best for fumigation, like eggs coming in a hatchery? What about eggs being shipped to a hatchery from a farm, and any fumigation in the trucks or on the farm? Can you kind of lump all those into a program from beginning to end?
So I guess, and I won't have specifics. If you need specifics on exact disinfectants or exact systems, email me. But in general, what seems to work fairly well for us is when the eggs are collected on the farms and they're kept in the egg coolers there, they'll get disinfected with some form of fogged disinfectant. I know in the past we've used everything from Viracid or Synergize to hypochloric acid we've used as well. And that one's a little bit of a weaker disinfectant, but once again, we're looking at reduction of risk, not elimination. So fumigate in the egg coolers on the farm if you can. The big thing is there, once again, do not go beyond the labels that are on the products for eggs. I have seen it personally where about 4 times as much Viracid was dumped into a fogger as it should have been mixed with water. And we basically sealed off all of the eggs that were directly in the path of the fog. None of them hatched.
And I think in that in talking with Henry, that you and I both know very well, is that he had a situation where they were using a system like that, and they never emptied their jugs, and so they kept adding that next allotment into the jug, which always had a little bit left, and eventually they got too high of a concentration and had exactly what you just said.
That might have been the exact same case.
Yeah, probably. But he said he clogged up pores, everything. A lot of these things, like we say, is that if it's done right, it's great. But if you start cutting corners or not paying attention to details, slowly some of these can become a problem.
So the two things with that I have seen in multiple areas of animal agriculture, and honestly, just in general with humans, if this chug is good, then chug is even better, is not the case when it comes to disinfectants. Right. Follow the label. You will be much better off than, but anyway, so beyond that, to answer the rest of your question, so we fogged the eggs while they're on the farm in the incubators, when they're on the farm in the egg coolers. Once we load them up onto the egg truck that comes to the hatchery, it's also beneficial to fog them there as well. So it could be something where when you back up the truck to the farm, you can also, once you load them on, point a fogger into that direction and get a good amount of fog into the truck before sealing it. Or once they get to the hatchery, before you unload them, open up the doors and fog the truck that way. As for which equipment to use on that, like I said, there's a lot of different options. I think every one of my hatcheries has a slightly different fogger that they use. The big thing is, as long as we're following label recommendations, and don't point the fogger directly at the eggs, because if you soak the eggs right where that mist is coming out of the fogger, you'll do the same thing as I mentioned earlier with clogging up the pores and sealing them off. So once they come off the trailer, so at that point in time, they've been fumigated or fogged twice. Then you bring them into an egg cooler that is separate from the rest of the hatchery. Ideally, that area you can fog each night as well, with depending on which disinfectant you're using and everything for which level. But we make sure that everything gets fogged on a daily basis as well. Anything that's kept overnight in that egg room without going into a setter gets fumigated once again. So that's where this is where that reduction concept really comes in, because that first fog on the farm might knock down the bacteria by 10%. That fog in or fumigation in the truck might knock it down another 15%. Each night in the egg room might knock it 5% down on top of that. By the time you get them into the setters, you might be down only 20% of your original bio burden or bacterial levels, virus levels, whatever you're dealing with.
Now, when we're doing any sort of fumigation or fogging of eggs and wherever they're at, is there a big difference in maintaining any sort of temperature or humidity, or how would that affect?
Depends on, that's going to also depend on the disinfectant. If you send me an email with which disinfectant you're talking about, I know certain ones are temperature dependent. Formaldehyde is a very good example. I'm going to go back to the breeder farms for an example on this. If we try to formaldehyde fog barns in the middle of winter and the barn is at 10 degrees Fahrenheit, it doesn't work very well, because formaldehyde is very temperature dependent. Whereas if we can get those barns up to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, it's going to work a lot better.
Okay. So that was kind of a follow-up question somebody had asked about that too, the formaldehyde and the temperature stuff. So what if we've done some over fumigation of eggs or chicks, and what effect are we going to see in those chicks?
Depends on the disinfectant, depends on how over fumigated they are.
What about formaldehyde? If you overuse formaldehyde, what would we typically might see in chicks?
Oh, potentially. That's depending on the concentration, how over fumigated. Could it be anything from some deformities, poor hatches? Might not see any effect depending on how you do it. My best suggestion with any of those situations would be, because they're all going to be, you're never going to see the exact same situation unless you manage to perfectly nail over fumigating multiple times in a row. Yeah. My best suggestion would be do a breakout. Might be something as early as, say, 10 days in incubation. Pull out 2 racks or two SSTs. Pull out 2 egg trays and crack them open and see where you're at. Are the embryos still alive? Did they fail to make it past the blood ring stage? Something along those lines. It'll give you a better idea where they're at for the hatch and what you're going to be expecting on residue and everything else. The other thing is keep records on it, because if you did that and you do a transfer breakout as well as a hatch breakout and you keep track of what you saw, then you'll know what to do or not to do again in the future.
Right. And when you saw it and when those eggs came through your system, and back it up a little bit. Yeah, for sure. There's no, so if somebody sees chicks and say they think they have some MG positive flocks out there, is there any signs on the chicks you might see if they're other than a testing of them?
That one I'm going to have to get back to you on, because you
wouldn't set eggs with MG, I'm sure. Yeah.
So I haven't personally seen any MG positive chicks. So I'll have to get back to you on that rather than give you a potentially incorrect answer.
Yeah. Well, fair enough. If you haven't seen it, you don't want to take a guess, like we talked about. So, okay. Well, there's a few other questions on here that are a little bit more specific, and so I think we're going to kind of stop with the questions right now. And there might be some that you can help answer after the fact, because they're a little bit more specific and detailed. But thank you everybody for coming and joining us today, and thank you so much, Dr. Pettit, for helping us and educating us and talking to us and entertaining the questions. We have a very good presentation. I enjoyed it. I learned a lot myself. So really appreciate your time and effort in being with us. And for all of you that attended, thank you for attending. And we hope to see you again. And you will be getting an email so you can watch this, share it with your friends or whatever, watch the recording of this, and also a PDF of our presentation. So thank you, everybody. Thank you. And hope to see you again later.
Thank you.
Bye.